Mohammed bin Salman, the powerful crown prince of Saudi Arabia, has become a symbol of ambition and strategic foresight in the Middle East. Known for his sweeping Vision 2030 reforms and transformative policies, MBS is not someone who gets easily impressed or convinced. So when Ibrahim Traoré, the young and bold president of Burkina Faso, reached out with a vision of his own, MBS was naturally skeptical. But what happened next? It wasn't just diplomacy. It wasn't just another African leader pitching a plan. This was different. Let's go back a bit. Ibrahim Traoré shocked the world when he rose to power in 2022 at the age of just 34, becoming the youngest head of state in the world at that time. His rise was not the result of privilege or political grooming. It was born out of frustration, conviction, and a deep desire to liberate his country from the chains of neo-colonialism and foreign influence. He had one thing in mind: sovereignty, and he wasn't afraid to speak it out loud. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, had long been under the shadow of foreign military interventions, economic dependency, and resource exploitation. But Traoré's leadership marked a turning point. He began to talk openly about resisting imperialist influence. He kicked out French military forces. He started forging stronger ties with nations that respected African sovereignty. And that's where his vision began to echo beyond the borders of Africa. Saudi Arabia under MBS has been scouting for new and meaningful partnerships outside traditional Western alliances. But still, when Traoré's proposal landed on the EU table in Riyadh, it raised eyebrows. A young African revolutionary with no elite diplomatic entourage proposing strategic cooperation? MBS wasn't going to sign off easily. So, what did Traoré do? He didn't come with a begging bowl. He came with a blueprint. Traoré's proposal was centered around a bold Pan-African initiative, a vision of energy independence, agricultural self-sufficiency, and mineral resource ownership, all backed by regional security cooperation and long-term sustainability. But what truly caught MBS's attention was how Traoré linked it to a mutually beneficial future with Saudi Arabia. Traoré spoke of Burkina Faso's untapped lithium and gold reserves, critical elements in the global energy transition. Instead of selling raw materials to the West for pennies, he envisioned a partnership with Saudi Arabia to build local refining and processing plants. He offered joint ownership, not dependency. He proposed collaboration in solar energy. Saudi Arabia, already a pioneer in desert-based solar infrastructure, could help West Africa achieve clean energy sovereignty, and in return, gain a strategic foothold in one of the most resource-rich yet underdeveloped regions of the world. He also highlighted the possibility of launching agricultural cooperation using Saudi technology to improve Burkina Faso's food production while supplying affordable food products back to Gulf nations facing harsh climates. This wasn't just a diplomatic pitch. It was a vision of the global South rising together, independently, confidently, and strategically. And here's where Mohammed bin Salman paused. This wasn't the usual narrative he'd been hearing from African nations. This wasn't about aid. It was about investment. It wasn't about dependence. It was about dignity. Traoré's clarity, fearlessness, and Pan-African vision reminded MBS of his own transformation plans back home. Vision 2030 is about less oil, more innovation, and stronger regional influence. Traoré's ideas aligned with that ethos, only this time from a different continent. After hours of intense discussions and closed-door meetings, the skepticism started to fade. MBS saw not just a young rebel, but a strategic thinker, a leader who understood the global shifts in power, a man ready to walk away from old systems and shape a new one. And that's when it happened. Mohammed bin Salman said yes. He agreed to initiate a bilateral task force to study investment and security cooperation. He greenlit a delegation to visit Burkina Faso. And for the first time, Saudi Arabia began considering West Africa not just as a market, but as a partner. This moment marked the beginning of a potential shift in geopolitics, an unlikely bridge between the heart of Africa and the sands of Arabia. What makes this story so powerful is not just the handshake between two leaders, it's what they represent: youth, courage, disruption, vision. In a world dominated by old alliances and legacy powers, new leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are breaking the mold. And when even the most powerful skeptics begin to say yes, that's when you know the future is shifting. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about Africa rising on its own terms, and the world is beginning to listen. And while that moment between Mohammed bin Salman and Ibrahim Traoré was making headlines behind closed doors, another quiet but equally powerful meeting was unfolding thousands of miles away. This time, in the heart of South America. It was a humid evening in Brasilia when Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, hosted a private roundtable discussion with a select group of African and Middle Eastern envoys. The topic? A new multipolar trade corridor that would bypass traditional Western-controlled ports, creating a direct south-south route for energy, food, and rare earth minerals. Among the attendees was none other than Mali's transitional president, Assimi Goïta, a figure often misunderstood in mainstream narratives but increasingly gaining influence across Africa for his unapologetic stance on sovereignty, security, and reclaiming national resources. Petro had been watching events in West Africa closely. He saw something familiar in the fire of these young African leaders, an echo of Latin America's own long-standing struggle against neo-colonial economics and debt dependency. And he knew it was time to bridge those two worlds. What came out of that meeting was quietly historic. Petro proposed a bold idea, a South Atlantic Pact. It wasn't a military alliance or an anti-West bloc. It was something deeper. It was an agreement based on mutual recognition, local value addition, and joint innovation. It aimed to link African agricultural surpluses with Latin American processing facilities, to share ecological expertise on rainforest preservation, to co-invest in port infrastructure from Dakar to Recife, to connect the lithium triangle of South America with the gold and cobalt belts of West Africa without relying on traditional financial gatekeepers. Assimi Goïta, usually cautious in diplomatic engagements, was visibly intrigued. He understood what was at stake. Mali, like many Sahel nations, had resources, but no refining power. Meanwhile, Latin America had the technology, the ambition, and the same desire to break out of an extractive global system. The two leaders talked long after the others had left the room. Petro shared Colombia's lessons in post-conflict recovery, land reform, and water sovereignty. Goïta spoke candidly about Mali's struggles with terrorism, foreign manipulation, and the cost of rejecting imposed alliances. In the end, they shook hands not as politicians, but as men who had chosen to rewrite the futures of their nations from the ground up. Just a month later, a small but symbolic cargo ship left the port of Abidjan, carrying agricultural produce and raw gold bars bound for Barranquilla, Colombia. The route was inefficient by global standards, but that wasn't the point. The point was to take the first step. Because stories like these, quiet, intentional, rooted in shared resistance, are the ones that shape new worlds. The future isn't coming from the boardrooms of legacy empires. It's emerging from unexpected alliances, from leaders like Traore, Goïta, Petro, who dare to say, "We've had enough of being told what our potential is. We will define it ourselves." And trust me, when that future begins to accelerate, the world won't be ready. In a modest conference room in Ankara, far from the flashing cameras and scripted press conferences, yet another quiet revolution was taking shape. This time, the architect wasn't a head of state or a billionaire diplomat. It was a woman. Aissata Tall Sall, the foreign minister of Senegal, had arrived in Turkey for what seemed like a routine bilateral discussion. But she wasn't there for routine. She came with a mission and a question that pierced through the formalities. What if Africa didn't just buy drones, but built them? Her audience? Turkish defense officials and the leadership of Baykar Technologies, the very company behind the famous Bayraktar drones that changed the nature of warfare in Ukraine, Syria, and beyond. The room froze. No African minister had ever approached them like this, not with a purchase order, but with a proposition. Aysata had done her homework. She knew that Turkey, under President Erdogan, had grown its defense industry by rejecting dependency and investing heavily in local engineering talent. She saw parallels between that journey and the one her own continent was now embarking on. Senegal, and West Africa more broadly, had been grappling with insurgency, terrorism, and border insecurity for years. Foreign militaries had come and gone. Weapons were imported, debts piled up, but sovereignty remained out of reach. Aysata's idea was to break that cycle. She proposed a joint African-Turkish UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, development hub. Not just assembly, but design, testing, training, and eventually full production. She offered Senegal as the base with land, legal support, and a ready pool of STEM graduates who had been underutilized for far too long. At first, the Turkish officials hesitated. They were used to buyers, not builders. But Aysata didn't blink. She laid out her vision clearly. Africa should no longer be a showroom for second-hand defense tech. It should be a frontier of innovation, owned by Africans but open to partnerships built on respect and transfer of knowledge, not control. She pointed out the long-term opportunity, Senegal's access to the Atlantic. The rising demand across ECOWAS countries for regional aerial surveillance. The advantage of entering the African market not as a seller, but as a co-creator. What followed were 3 days of intense negotiations, silent walks through hangars, technical demonstrations, feasibility mapping, and by the end, the skepticism had shifted. Baykar agreed to send a delegation to Dakar, not to sell, to explore building. It was a small step, but one that could mark the beginning of Africa's entry into indigenous aerospace defense. Aysata returned home without flashy headlines or photo ops. But she had done something far more powerful than pose for cameras. She had quietly tilted the axis of power. She had shown that African leaders, especially African women, are no longer satisfied with symbolic inclusion. They want ownership. Because this is what's happening now. Africa is no longer asking to be saved. It's asking to be seen, not as a market, but as a partner, a contributor, a force. These stories, Traore, Goita, Petro, Aysata, aren't accidents, they're signals. A new generation of leaders is reshaping the world quietly, intentionally, and without apology. The age of quiet compliance is ending. And when these voices finally rise in unison, the global order will sound very different. In the bustling heart of Kuala Lumpur, where towering skyscrapers touch the clouds and ancient markets whisper the wisdom of generations, a different kind of summit was underway, one with no press coverage, no grand speeches, and no ceremonial fanfare. But its implications would soon ripple across continents. Seated around a simple round table in a private hall were 3 men, each representing a region historically excluded from the centers of power. From Southeast Asia, Anwar Ibrahim, the reformist Prime Minister of Malaysia. From West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary from Burkina Faso. And from Central Asia, Sadir Japarov, the president of Kyrgyzstan, a nation often overlooked but strategically positioned at the crossroads of China, Russia, and the Islamic world. What brought them together wasn't ideology or religion. It was something deeper, a shared belief that small nations, when aligned, can no longer be ignored. The conversation began with trade. Traoré spoke passionately about how Burkina Faso was rich in gold, manganese, and cotton, but lacked refineries, railways, or value chains that benefited its people. Every step of extraction was outsourced. Every profit margin left the continent. Japarov nodded. Kyrgyzstan, too, had watched as its rare earths were exported raw, while locals remained in poverty. He revealed something unexpected. His country had begun small-scale refining programs, quietly supported by local scientists with minimal foreign interference. The results were modest, but promising. That's when Anwar leaned forward. He shared Malaysia's secret to economic independence: strategic patience. In the 1980s, when many nations were being pushed into debt by international lenders, Malaysia chose a different path. They didn't just open their markets, they built institutions, nurtured engineers, and pushed for technology transfers in every deal. And now, Anwar said, it was time to pass that wisdom forward. He proposed something radical: the creation of a South-South Technological Compact, a pact where developing nations would exchange not just resources but skills. Engineers from Burkina Faso could be trained in Malaysian institutions. Kyrgyz labs could test West African minerals. Technology would not be gifted, it would be shared. More importantly, this pact would exclude traditional development banks. Instead, it would be funded by sovereign wealth funds, public crypto reserves, and natural resource revenue, all pooled and governed by the Global South. Traore, listening intently, was struck not by the ambition of the idea, but by its realism. It wasn't a speech. It was a blueprint. He pulled out a folder, documents drafted by his economic council. They aligned almost perfectly with what Anwar and Japarov had just described. The timing was uncanny. That night, under the soft glow of Kuala Lumpur's skyline, the three leaders signed a memorandum of understanding. Not a formal alliance, but a declaration of intent. No headlines were made. No Western analysts noticed. But something had shifted. For the first time, leaders from Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia had agreed. Their futures would no longer be shaped by the echoes of empires past. They would build a new system, quietly, cooperatively, and away from the noise. And that's what makes this new global shift so powerful. It's not born in revolutions on the street, but in quiet rooms, bold conversations, and the simple decision to say yes to each other,